My wife is calling.
Capitalism is essentially a system of mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. It pours a horn of plenty upon the common man. It has raised the average standard of living to a height never dreamed of in earlier ages. It has made accessible to millions of people enjoyments which a few generations ago were only within the reach of a small elite. That is today's quote from The Anti-Capitalist Mentality by Ludwig von Mises. To discuss capitalism, we have the director and moderator of the Soho Forum and the former economics and books editor at Barron's, Gene Epstein. Gene, thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be with you, Keith, the guy who did that great 5-hour movie that I'm still watching and still enjoying.
Yes, he's referring to The Ultimate Red Pill.
Yeah.
All right. So, Gene, what is capitalism and why are you a capitalist?
Well, it's interesting that you began with that quote, and it does come from the greatest economist of the 20th century. The 21st century is still young, so we don't know who's going to be the greatest one this time around. That was, of course, Ludwig von Mises. That was a very accurate statement of Mises historically. It was an accurate historical statement about the nature of capitalism, because that was the choice that people made to produce for profit. And obviously, when you're producing for profit, you're necessarily producing for the masses. When you're producing for profit, you're necessarily employing masses of people. And since it's impossible, virtually impossible to perform cartels either on the sell side or the buy side of the market, then what inevitably happens is that the wage rises because capitalists compete for wage earners. Are you still there, Keith, by the way?
Absolutely, yeah. I was just writing something down.
So all of that is valid, but what I prefer to say about why I support capitalism is because it is necessary, although not sufficient. It's the economic system that is necessary, although not sufficient, to freedom for the broad masses of people. And then to the extent that we all want affluence, it is equally necessary, but not sufficient. Now, with respect to the freedom part of it, it's clear that potentially you could have free market capitalism, and it's necessary to own the means of production, have private ownership of the means of production for people to exercise free choice, because almost all the choices we make in life require the use of scarce resources. And if those scarce resources are monopolized in some way by some kind of communal entity or state entity, then we have limited access to those scarce resources. And very possibly the entity that monopolizes those scarce resources is not going to allow a Keith Knight to use his house even, or to use the mechanisms that we're using right now in order to express our free speech. So we need private ownership of the means of production in order to exercise our freedom of speech, our freedom to form any kind of productive enterprise we may want. It's not sufficient because potentially you could have a government that throws you in jail, that's going to throw me and Keith Knight in jail after this broadcast or podcast because we're going to say something that the government doesn't like. But without private ownership, it's inconceivable that you can have any kind of freedom, including, as I say, the freedom to run some productive enterprise and manufacture whatever you want and then hope it sells. And if it doesn't sell, try something else. All of those freedoms have to be manifested in terms of private ownership of the means of production. Now that's key and that's essential. When Mises talked about the mass production of capitalism, he was right that was manifested in a profit-seeking capitalism, ambitious entrepreneurs selling to the masses, bidding up wages. All of that is a wonderful system. But I do want to tell the socialists, however, that you can form an enterprise with any purpose whatsoever. I don't know that Keith Knight is really in it for profit, financial profit. You're probably in it mainly for psychic profit. you could probably do a lot of other things that could make you a lot more money, which segues into the other part of it, which is that Mises actually, I think, emphasized too much the idea of consumer sovereignty. It was Murray Rothbard who pointed out that, yes, indeed, we do try to please consumers, most of us. However, essentially, at the end of the day, we have the capitalist system is a system of individual sovereignty. Keith Knight does whatever the heck he pleases. Yeah, maybe your parents wanted you to go to law school and earn a heck of a lot more money than you are earning now. I probably could have made a lot more money as a litigator if I'd gone to law school, but I preferred to do what I wanted to do. And so individual sovereignty is key. And also the other key part of it about why I would support capitalism is because if you want to be a socialist, if you want to promote socialist values, the socialist values, for example, of income and wage equality, of community, of worker control, whatever you like, whatever floats your boat, you can form enterprises and pursue those goals. All you have to do is pay your bills. And that's because the key argument I made to Bhaskar Sankara when I debated socialism with him. So I hope that's a sufficient answer to why I support capitalism, because it actually enables the socialist dream to be realized if that's what floats your boat.
Absolutely. Good. I love when someone answers multiple questions in one answer. So what would you say are the best real world examples of capitalism, working of capitalism being morally justified and economically beneficial?
Real world examples. Wow. Okay. Well, because when you force me to take real world examples, we're of course taking highly imperfect examples, and the examples that I would want to give anybody who doubts capitalism and doubts its capacity to lift the living standards of the masses, something that I care about greatly. As a bleeding heart capitalist, I actually came from a socialist background. We could go into that. If I climbed out of that background, then you could do it too. If I started from such an intellectual disadvantage as I did when I was a kid, then you can do it too. But getting to your question about real life examples, the real life examples that I would want to cite are, first of all, the two cases in which history offers us a replica, an approximation of a controlled experiment. The two cases are, of course, West Germany and East Germany, North Korea and South Korea. And in the case of West Germany versus East Germany, after World War II, Germany was split in two, and the West mainly pursued capitalism. It was obviously imperfect, but it was mainly and fundamentally capitalist. And the East mainly pursued socialism. It was mainly and fundamentally socialist. It was actually regarded as the wealthiest socialist economy of all, commonly. That was the German Democratic Republic. And what did we get? We got a situation in which, in both parts of these two halves, everybody was German. The culture was similar. The traditions were similar. So we're controlling for those factors that otherwise influence economic outcomes. And what did we get in the case of West versus East? We got a situation in which the West flourished and the East was impoverished. And so that's about as close a controlled experiment as history gives us. Then, of course, there was reunification. The West acquired the East and refurbished it, spent a fortune of money on it. All of that is an interesting history as well. Now, of course, we still have an example, South Korea versus North Korea, North being primarily communist, South being primarily capitalist. South Korea is an economic powerhouse. North Korea is economically impoverished. The third example that I would give is not a controlled experiment, but a good historical lesson. The lesson of the U.S. in the 19th century. In the 19th century, U.S., taking the period from 1870 to about 1925, about 55 years, we do have records, an enormous increase in the living standards of the broad masses of people. And on top of that, what happened was that labor was very compromised because there was massive migration into the country from my ancestors, awful lot of cheap labor coming into the country. The unions were barely representative of the labor force. Unions were quite weak. That's not until the 1930s when the Roosevelt administration empowered unions. No minimum wage laws, no real government intervention in labor markets to supposedly protect the workers from exploitation by the capitalists. And yet real wages steadily rose. So that could only have happened because of the benefits of free market capitalism. The fourth example that I would give empirically is the market liberalization reforms instituted in China in 1978, which led to several 100 million Chinese climbing out of poverty. China is far from a capitalist country, but its capitalist reforms pushed by the farmers brought an enormous revolution in living standards in other parts of the Asian world as well. India, the turn toward capitalism, turn toward free markets, toward greater economic freedom, also brought immense numbers of people in those areas of the world climbing out of poverty. So those are several real world examples I would give to those people who doubt capitalism, who think it's only for the rich, only for the elites, to point out to them that this stellar record is on the one side, and on the other side, if we look at the examples of those countries that suppress capitalism, as China did until the late 1970s, then we get nothing but starvation and impoverishment pretty much staring us in the face.
What do you believe about the difference between private property and, say, personal property, as the socialist might say? For example, I can own this book or a car or a computer because it's things that I use that I have reasonable access to.
Yeah.
Whereas if I own, say, a factory, I can sit in my room, I can buy it, I can trade with it, I can have people buy stock in it, all without actually using it. Why is it morally justified to own a large piece of land that other people are working on if you are not directly involved with the upkeep, or if you are indirectly involved with the upkeep?
Okay, let's see now. You give me a nice loaded question. Let's understand. You, maybe this is true of you, Keith. I guess that's the reason why you're able to maintain this part. You own this property, and you're not directly involved with the upkeep. May I ask, how did you acquire it in the first place? Is that am I cheating by asking you that? Did you inherit it? Is that what happened hypothetically? How did you acquire something that you didn't and you're not? How did it come into your hands? This thing that you own and that you're not directly involved with. How'd you get it?
I bought the title from the previous owner,
Okay.
who no longer wanted it and thought my money was more valuable than keeping the property himself.
I think maybe you're going to say I'm being too difficult. Where'd you get that money, Keith, to buy it with? Who financed you that way? How'd you get the bankroll to do it with?
I just inherited it from my rich parents, who were the Rockefellers.
Okay. Yeah. Well, all right. I mean, you now trace. I mean, okay. You're now creating a little puzzle for me, which is now. Did the Rockefellers have a right to give it to you? I mean, to my mind, that reverts to whether the Rockefellers earned it in a rightful way, in a moral way. If you want to give me the Rockefellers as an example, let's call you Keith Knight Rockefeller for a moment, and you inherited Rockefeller money. I mean, the money did come legitimately from Rockefeller producing oil, and that people wanted to buy. And it's difficult for me as a libertarian. Actually, I wouldn't even put it that way. Don't like to put it negatively. I would say that that clearly, if anybody legitimately acquires wealth by selling something to other people that those people want, or actually, maybe you think I'm cheating, but let me use the example of Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick, who wrote a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in which he talked about how let's take a socialist economy in which income distribution is dictated according to exactly the way everybody thinks is just. And then, so that's in the first instance, everybody's got money according to a just allocation. But then let's say he invented the idea of Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain, a great basketball star in his day, who does a demonstration of his basketball skills in the evening, and he charges admission and they each pay him at 25 cents, and he makes $1 million from it. And if in the first instance the income distribution was just, what are we going to do about the secondary effects? People gave Wilt the Stilt $1 million because they like his skills. The point is that if we're going to control people's ability to make money by selling goods or service to others that those people want to buy, then it sort of conjures up basically the fascist state. We're going to have to be ever on our guard for those people. And in the case of Rockefeller, from whom Keith Knight inherited this money with which he bought that factory, then what are we going to do? The guy sold oil, and are we going to really police him, police his ability to sell the oil? Well, the people wanted to buy the oil. All of that basically intrudes on freedom. And so if that guy made the money selling the oil, then the next question is, what does he have a right to do with his money, what he sees fit? As a practical consequentialist matter, I would say that even if he leaves his money to a ne'er-do-well like his son Keith or his grandson Keith, even if he does that, I would rather see that happen than see the money go into the government cheese factory. Because the government will more than likely often uses that money only to help other rich people in so many ways: bail out banks, bail out companies, fight destructive wars. I don't trust the government cheese factory. So even in a consequentialist sense, the idea that we're better off taking Rockefeller's money and charging him 100% inheritance tax when he estate tax rather when he leaves it, and denying all of it to his heir Keith, that bothers me, and it should bother anybody who confronts the consequences of what government does with money. But more than likely, Keith, his son, will actually do something useful for with that money. It sounds as though you bought a factory and you're bankrolling it. The factory is still operating. You've done some good with it, but basically, what you've allocated it to managers who are managing it well without your intervention. Is that the hypothesis here? And what happens is that you're not doing a whole lot, but you're making some dividends and some profits from it. Well, okay. That could happen. I mean, it could also happen, by the way, that if you don't keep your eye on the business, you get cheated by those managers. If you're really an absentee owner, you'll have one of what business people call the silent partner who skims off you. So even that hypothetical case, you probably have to watch it and be involved. And usually, most of the time, inherited money is invested in stocks and bonds. It usually does some good. Let me see. Did I lose track of your question? See, oh yeah. So you were talking about the difference, Keith, is what I should have called the difference between personal property and private property. And you gave me a difficult case in which this person Keith is doing very little. He's just basically clipping coupons, earning dividends. But the broader question is this: when I addressed Bhaskar Sankara, when I debated him at the Soho Forum about socialism, he himself, I quoted his own distinction, which is that we socialists do not want to take your Kenny Loggins records from you. You could keep your personal property, your personal property, but your private property, that's what we want. That's what we need. Has to be run by some kind of communal or government body. And if you do that, the problem you run into, as I mentioned earlier, is that you make it impossible for crowdfunding to occur. I mean, $50 billion a year raised from crowdfunding. What is crowdfunding? Crowdfunding gives Kenny Loggins wannabes the opportunity to rent sound studios or to buy sound studios, to rent offices, to get access to the means of production so that they can do their thing. But if you don't allow the opportunity to rent or to buy offices, stores, all of those things, then how can we have 100 flowers bloom? That's why private property is essential to the exercise of freedom. And if because of that we have to tolerate the occasional Keith who inherited money from his Rockefeller grandfather, and who we feel is actually a ne'er-do-well, just clipping some coupons, if we have to tolerate that, and we don't want the government to take all of the property that Rockefeller owned, then so be it. It's a very minor price to pay to have a system of freedom in which people can exercise their right to be free, to publish, to form enterprises, selling whatever they want, to be Kenny Loggins wannabes, by preserving the system of private property, because it's essential to freedom. Incidentally, on top of that, it also produces affluence for the masses.
A very important basic question that you'd think would be obvious, but still needs explaining. You said you don't trust government with the money because they often benefit the wealthy at the expense of others, or they start wars of aggression. What is the difference between a government and a company?
Well, this has actually been articulated pretty well in James Buchanan's public choice theory, and versus private choice. He posited to begin with that what this theory that he colloquially dubbed politics without romance. The progressives' romantic view of politicians and of government is that the way they brand themselves is the way they really are. They brand themselves as public servants working for the public good. That's what a politician describes himself as being. Clearly, what else is he going to say? Because he's running for office. And it's appalling and amazing that we have supposedly sophisticated people actually opine that at the end of the day, isn't it true that government tries to do good, and that people in the private sector are only in it for their own private greed? So they are being snookered by the branding. The branding, of course, by government is that they're in it for the good of humanity and the good of society. But Buchanan said, with politics without romance, we understand not that these are evil people necessarily, not that these are uniquely awful people necessarily in government, but only that they pretty much are furthering their own ends, are looking out for their own good, pretty much the way people normally do as a first approximation in a very large society. We're not talking about, specific communes or families where people are trying to serve each other as friends and relatives. We're talking about the larger society. So as a first approximation, people in government are looking out for their own good, pretty much the way people in the private sector are. Now, but then what is the key difference from there? How do those people in government know to look out for their own good? Well, they look out for their own good by winning an election, by telling enough people, 51% of the voters, that you should vote for me because I have certain things to deliver and certain promises to make. But if they're going to form enterprises, if they're going to get involved with delivering the mail, for example, as they do, if they're going to get involved with any activity that involves economics, then one of the key things that we all know is that they will not be subjecting themselves to the lash of profit and loss. They have three main ways of raising money. One of them is through force. That's through taxation. And that, of course, says pay up or go to prison. So that's their way of raising money. That's the main way of raising money. Otherwise, it's also through borrowing. And because they're backed through taxation, they can borrow at preferential rates. And then third, and most insidiously, if you're the federal government, it's through printing money. And that's, of course, the key reason why government wants to print money is because in order to fight its wars, because people have difficulty of financing a war through taxation. So they have all those nefarious means of raising money, whereas in the private sector, the only way to raise money is through private backing. And the only way to make money is by selling something to people that those people want to buy. And then third, the only way to stay afloat is to at least make back your costs so that you can survive. And so that's the reason why, in the vast majority of activities, we should trust private enterprise rather than public enterprise.
Yes, there was an interesting exchange with you and Bhaskar in your debate in which he says, I'm not actually sure if I would hire Gene,
Oh.
after he gets so excited.
Yes.
And I thought, I'm like, okay, I get that he's joking, but isn't that
No.
interesting that that it's okay to not hire someone, but to hire someone for wage labor without them owning the company is totally immoral. So you can give them $0 an hour, you can give them no experience, you can give them no foot in the door, but you can't offer them $1, $2, $5, $10 an hour in exchange for their time, labor, whether it's there or remote. I just thought that was an incredible statement that he made.
You're introducing a point that's actually new to me. See, I will say, by the way, that I really regretted the moments when I lost my temper with Bhaskar, and when I got a little bit impatient. He really sent me over the edge when he talks about that he prefers a government-run bank to allocate all scarce financial resources. But then when this is when I was being a little hard on him and impatient and difficult, because again I found that he was being a little thick-headed, and in a way I was probably arguing with my younger self. So I really regret that. But I'm interested in your point. Explain a little better. You're saying that he would not employ me because I'm an obnoxious personality. That's what he was basically saying, somewhat facetiously. I hesitate to bring him in because he seems like a really difficult guy. So that was okay. What was your point? What you just made?
My point was, he said that wage labor would be abolished. In other words, you can choose to not hire someone, not give them any opportunity, not give them a foot in the door, not give them experience.
In my case, for example, because I'm obnoxious. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Not give them on-the-job training, but you can't hire them in exchange for money, in exchange for their time. Isn't that incredible? Like that's the entire minimum wage argument.
Well, that's right. That's right. Oh, yeah. You know what? Yeah, I guess. Well, if we'd pursued that, I guess, right. He said that, I'm not sure I'd want to bring Gene into my productive organization because he sounds like he's got such a difficult personality. And I guess I could have said, well, then who's going to hire me, Bhaskar? What's going to happen? I guess he could say, well, we'd force you to go to charm school. I don't know, whatever. Well, anyway, you make a good point, I guess, in a way. That was good. You can't pay people wages, but of course, I asked him, if somebody is voluntarily working for me, and I'm paying that person a wage, are you going to send us to prison and forbid it? And he fumbled about that. He said, well, that person wouldn't want to work for you. They'd want to just work in our commune, all kinds of crazy stuff. But basically, if the answer to Bhaskar is, look, if you don't like it, then own the means of production and compete with capitalist enterprises, and run a company that pays everybody the same amount. Run a company that's democratically run, and see if you can make a go of it. Why not? Why not do that? Anyway, you were going to say, Keith, what?
No, that's fine. I'm curious, when say the rubber really hits the road, going from your capitalist principles to real world reality, say that it would be a violation of someone's self-ownership property rights to force them to take, say, the polio vaccination, or to force them to fund something like the Postal Service so people can access mail they might not otherwise access. Where do you stand with regard to when your capitalist principles may conflict with reality?
Okay, I'm saying the capitalist principle being that that forcible taking is not allowed. Is that what you're saying? That capitalist principle? Yeah.
Correct.
See, here I'm a bit of a weakling, Keith, and see, this is where my anarchist friends get impatient with me. In my old age, I guess I have a little bit of difficulty saying anything other than this, which is I'd rather not say to most people that taxation is theft. I would rather say that taxation is a forcible appropriation from somebody else. And the forcible appropriation is clearly a violation, and the only way to justify it is through some overwhelming argument. The default position is you don't forcibly appropriate ever, but maybe under certain circumstances, there is some justification for it. Well, now what that does, of course, is it opens up the way for the night watchman state. You might say, well, we're arguing that that we do need a state to defend against force and fraud, that, as the founding fathers said in the Declaration of Independence, to secure our rights, governments are instituted among men. So if the government is securing our rights, a right not to be defrauded and not to be violated in terms of our person and property, and if it's doing this through police and courts. I know, for example, that the Ayn Randians often spoke about possibly getting government to be financed voluntarily, but even they agreed that maybe there would have to be involuntary transfers. And so that's the argument I prefer to make, which is that that forcible transfers are inherently bad, but and the default position is to avoid them. But if there's some greater good that can trump that, can overcome that bad, then maybe certain forcible transfers are in certain instances necessary. And then I would argue, well, the night watchman minarchist state does not require a whole lot of money to be raised, and so a little bit of forcible transfer is okay. Clearly, anybody who says taxation is theft is in effect really saying that the only possible just society is the anarcho-capitalist society. And maybe that person is right. I have a little bit of discomfort with that, so I'm clearly a bit of an unprincipled person, a bit of an emotional weakling, intellectual weakling, and so I would grant the possibility for forcible transfer of funds under those circumstances. What are you, Keith? You're an ANCAP, no doubt, huh? Yeah.
Well, yes, I would say that I do want property rights enforced. I want courts. I want a lot of these things, schools. However, I'm not willing to initiate aggression to achieve them. I also need food, clothing, housing, lighting, but I'm not willing to initiate aggression. And also say that we need a court system. I always think on the principle of voluntarily funded competition is superior to coercively funded monopoly. Yes. I believe that applies in the Gustav D. Molinari method of if it applies to all industries except police, courts, and why does it not apply to those? Well, I also believe it does. So even if you run into the, it's hard to exclude people from the benefits of an army. Well, you can still crowdfund those things. You can voluntarily fund them. We have a lot of charity. And also, why does this group, government, have the right to collect funds coercively, but no other group because you vote for them? Well, let's say the Catholic Church every 4 years lets you vote for the Pope. Then does the Pope have the right to tax you and regulate you and so forth? So because government, by definition, is based on initiating violence against peaceful people on property it hasn't acquired through voluntary exchange or original appropriation, I think all government's illegitimate. I would just say if Gene Epstein can't do it, then Donald Trump can't do it. If you write words down on paper and call them an executive order, that doesn't make them moral. Or if, if you did any of the things government did, you would be a warmongering terrorist, thief, and psycho trying to violently dominate people. So I just hold government to the same standard I would hold any other group or organization to. That is where I stand.
Yes. Well, I'm going to basically agree with you. I guess part of my excuse is that I find that I'm very frequently arguing with progressives, and it goes down a little bit easier to talk about the minarchist night watchman state. It goes down a little bit easier to talk about the vision of the founding fathers about the limited state. Although at the end of the day, you have a good argument, and as a matter of fact, I would even for the moment supplement it and point out, as Brian Kaplan has, for example, who's a real disciple of his old college buddy Michael Huemer, who's written very similar works. You're probably familiar with Michael Huemer. I noticed recently that Brian's answer to what would anarchy be like is to point out empirically that we actually have more private sector police in this society now than public sector. We have an extensive private sector court system in which people go to mediation. In a way, we almost have those nascent anarchist institutions where people go voluntarily. And certainly, and interestingly, I wonder if you know even much about this, Keith. I will say that anybody who's confronted the court system, the monopoly court system, and how badly it metes out justice on every level, civil and criminal, you'd almost say, my God, anything but this bureaucracy, this cartel of lawyers. The judges are lawyers. The lawyers are they're all interchangeable. How they ruin people when lawsuits are brought. It's just such an appalling mess that you'd think that anything but the government-run courts is better than the privately run courts. So you've won me over, Keith, except at the end of the day, I find it a little bit easier to argue the more limited case. I would also underscore your other point, which is that for example, with respect to the army or cops or other things, they often talk about the Freerider effect. The Freerider effect being that you benefit from an armed defense force that protects you against some attack from somewhere else and so on. So you won't pay for it because you're a free rider, because it's like a public good. The public good argument that public goods necessarily have free riders, the old lighthouse, all the rest of it. It's at the end of the day, I would agree with you that by and large, people are pretty responsible. These things will not really be that costly. There will always be some free riders who won't kick in, but there are all kinds of mechanisms whereby money can be raised for all kinds of things for which there are free riders. And so and of course, top of that, when I argue for the minarchist state and the abolition of the welfare state, I make the argument that in a progressing economy like this one, unfettered by government, we'd have immense wealth. We would always presumably have people who through no fault of their own are in difficult circumstances, and there would be more than enough compassion for them in a compassionate society to fund them, to provide them with operations they might need or anything else that they need, because it really would not be that costly. And compassion is very common to us all, as Adam Smith argued. So at the end of the day, you do have a good argument, Keith, and it's very persuasive.
As far as the compassion argument goes, for anyone who appreciates the work done in this channel, I have recently lost my job, and in the description below, you can see my PayPal username if you'd like to donate some money to help me out.
What job did you lose, Keith? What job was that?
I was recently employed, and I no longer am. I'd get more specific, but Antifa, I'm sure, is watching me like a hawk, ready to follow my every move.
Oh my gosh.
As far as the free rider problem goes, well, tons of people don't pay taxes. I think it was 47% pay no income tax. Mitt Romney got in trouble for that, of all things. So government doesn't solve the free rider problem. Also, my house used to be in the middle of nowhere. Now there's tons of stores, tons of entertainment that has totally raised the value of my house. I've totally benefited from things other people have done. Just because I received that benefit, I don't think justifies them initiating aggression against me, forcing me to be regulated in some way or another, or forcing me to fund things I otherwise wouldn't enjoy. For example, the mall close to me raised my house a ton as far as value goes, and they still don't have the right to force me to shop there. So I think the free rider problem does not justify a coercive state.
Well, coincidentally, Keith, you're actually now addressing the argument of Henry George, the Georgists. Perhaps you're familiar with that. And there are people who are still Georgists who believe that if you own land, then you can get the returns that the money that's attributed to your improvement of that land could be yours, but that the money that results from the fact that that land is worth more precisely because of what you described, which is that there's more around that land that makes it more worthwhile, that you deserve no credit for, that part should be taxed away. That's the Georgist argument. And I think you've made a good argument against it, but the argument I would make is the old Rothbardian, it proves too much. it happens in every way. It's not just the land argument. Land can appreciate because other things are built up around it that makes that land more valuable. But how about somebody who starts in a particular profession and who has particular talents, and those talents are not especially valued 30 years ago, but that suddenly a whole lot of people who want to buy those talents. As a matter of fact, Little Grand Muses used the example of Greta Garbo. Perhaps you've never heard of her. She was a beautiful actress. As he said, Greta Garbo would probably be making no money at all, except the movie industry sprouted up, and because she was a beautiful woman and a good actress, she's made a fortune. She deserves no credit for that. It all happened because of the movie industry. She had those inherent talents, and she deserves no credit, just like the person who owns the land deserves no credit. So really, what it amounts to is that we're going to have the luck police scrutinizing every aspect of our good or bad fortune and saying to us, if your income has been enhanced because of lucky circumstances around you that you're not credited for, then we're going to tax it away. And of course, my other part of the argument is taxing it away into the government cheese factory, and God knows what you're going to do with that money. So there too, that's another argument. But interestingly, you've raised the Georgist argument about land. And land becoming more valuable because of factors that you deserve no credit for.
Yes, I'm saying that happens, but the Georgist goes further and says, because of that, taxation is justified. I'm saying just because my values increase because of other people's efforts doesn't mean. So I think YouTube's value has increased because of all the content creators. However, I don't think each one has the right to tax one another, whether it's YouTube or the content creator. Still things got to be voluntary. And the Georgist still has to answer if taxation is justified because you acquire benefits that were based on luck. You have to explain why this group, the government group, has a monopoly on issuing those taxes. Why can't anyone issue taxes if they're just this morally neutral thing that are totally justified? Why is it this group, the one responsible for tons of wars and famines and genocides? Why is it that group that gets to have a monopoly on issuing taxation? Well, I think Georgism is a little ridiculous.
Well, no. That's my. See, okay, you are going into my concept. I was about to say you are a very rights-oriented guy, and I like to, as an economist, of course, I can talk a lot about consequences, and of course, I was about to revert to my consequentialist argument. Much as, by the way, I'm highly critical about what the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, the Microsoft billionaire, what he does with his charitable foundation. But I would much prefer, however, if it's a forced choice, I'd much prefer to see him keep that money and give it away in the way he sees fit, however critical I am of the way he does it, rather than have it all taxed away by government. And simply, if government is helping the poor, then it's doing a very poor job of it. I mean, that's the other argument that you might make. Well, government is going to spend money on helping the underprivileged. By and large, government doesn't do a very good job of helping the poor. I think on balance, it hurts the poor. And so there's no particular reason to trust, as you indicate, those monopolists, those people whose incentives are all wrong. Their incentives are sex, money, and power. Those are the three most powerful drugs given to anybody. And people who pursue sex, money, and power in the private sector, at the very least, those motives are channeled by the lash of profit and loss into producing goods and services that people want to buy. And apart from that, I myself believe that the empirical data is overwhelming, that there's plenty of compassion in our society, certainly, to help people who do need help, do legitimately need help, at least need help according to my lights, and I don't have to force other people to help them. I think there are plenty of people who will be there to help them because there's plenty of charity. The charitable dollar goes to medical care, gravitates to medical care, for example. And if poor people need medical care, the charitable dollar will provide it in a much more efficiently run medical care system that would be run by the private sector.
Sure, as does a lot of capitalist investment and innovation and free trade and voluntary exchange and property rights improves our standard of living, as well as let's say you think all people are bad. Well, you better hope there's not a government people who are inherently bad can occupy, because
Yeah.
it's like moth to a light. It attracts the most evil people ever. The Maos, the Hitlers, the Stalins, the Kissingers, the Brzezinskis, the Madeleine Albrights of the world. So if you think people are bad, make sure there's not a state they can occupy and increase their evil 50-fold. Look at the number of people Ted Bundy killed versus I don't know, Ho Chi Minh, or just Kissinger's bombing of Laos and Cambodia alone killed more than Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. So I don't think that anything like that justifies.
Yes, that's the typical argument, as you know, the sort of Hobbesian argument that society is filled with psychopaths, and therefore that's why we need government. And as you said, then of course we have the great psychopaths of history, Mao Zedong and Stalin, and those psychopaths. At least those psychopaths would have far less power if we didn't have government. Quite right. Yeah.
And also, they believe that if the average person's a psychopath, and also they should have the right to vote. Like, you got to pick one. If they're evil, they're going to vote in evil people. So the existence of evil people is not improved if you give one group of also people a monopoly on violence. I do want to move on.
Okay, sure.
So after the socialism, statism really got a bad name after the 20th century between National Socialism, Mao's China, you have the Soviet Union, Cuba, Cambodia. After all those, the socialists have now reverted to saying, you know what, those aren't socialism. The socialism I'm talking about exists in Scandinavian countries, where there is a significant welfare state, where the state acts as a servant of the public who otherwise would not have the societal influence in the absence of a state. How do you respond to capitalism is unjust, and we have a working example of socialism in Scandinavian countries such as Denmark and Norway?
Yeah. Well, a few things to say about that. First, of course, you're only, I think, speaking tongue-in-cheek when you call the Scandinavian countries socialist. They do have stock markets. They have, according to data, they have more stringently enforced property rights in the Scandinavian countries than they have in this country. And so when the president of Denmark corrected Bernie Sanders, he said, no, we're a market economy. We're not a socialist economy. He knew whereof he spoke. So it is indeed, however, we ought to confront it, not that these are socialist economies, but these are capitalist economies with very strong welfare states. That's accurately characterizing the Scandinavian countries. So what do we have to say about that part of it, capitalist economies with active welfare states? Well, the next thing to say then is that when you talk about the supposed success of these Scandinavian countries in maintaining capitalist economies with strong welfare states, aren't you cherry picking? By cherry picking, I mean, aren't you ignoring all the other countries of Europe that also have capitalist economies with strong welfare states? Aren't you ignoring the countries of South America that had capitalist economies with strong welfare states? Mainly capitalist economies, all of them with stock exchanges. Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Argentina, indeed, Guatemala, other countries of that kind, and Brazil, all of those countries that experimented with market economies, however imperfect, with strong welfare states. So if you assemble them all, you find that the median performance of these economies is quite dismal. You find that the performance of the Scandinavian economies is pretty good, but the median performance is terrible. And then you might ask yourself, well, why did the Scandinavian countries do better, although they had their problems and stumbled? Well, It's possible because they're Scandinavians. You know, it gets back to Milton Friedman's quip when told on his visit to Sweden, "We have no poverty in Sweden." His quip was, "That's interesting. We have no poverty among Swedish Americans either." It's actually better. You do better if you're a Scandinavian living in the U.S. than if you're a Scandinavian living in Scandinavia. And so, again, the key point about these welfare states is that it's cheating to cherry pick. It's cheating to say, well, we had 30 people in our experiment, and look at how well those 4 people did. We're going to ignore those other 26 in the experiment. We're only going to talk about those 4. Because if we then talk about all 30 in the experiment, we find that it's a very dismal experiment. We find that that if we're going to ask the question, are we more likely, is the U.S. economy more likely to be like Greece if it implements that kind of welfare state, or is it more likely to be like Scandinavia? And the answer is overwhelming that it's more likely to be like Greece than like the Scandinavian countries. Why? Because we're not tiny, we're not homogeneous. We don't, all of these countries, by the way, virtually all of them, I forget which exception, they have populations that are fewer people than New York City. They're relatively homogeneous populations. Although, of course, in the case of Sweden and others, dealing and having very great difficulty with the immigrants that have come in. And then on top of that, if you even investigate Sweden and others, the welfare state is producing problems. There is backlash. But again, are we more likely to be like, put it another way, if we have Medicare for all, what if we call it Veterans Administration for All? Well, the Veterans Administration, as you may know, which was the complete government-run medical care system for veterans, was celebrated by Paul Krugman and others just a few years ago, until the scandals came out, until it became apparent that the Veterans Administration was a bureaucratically run charnel house. And so perhaps we should more appropriately call it Veterans Administration for All rather than Medicare for All. So again, Sweden. Now, the next final point that I would make is that the Scandinavian countries would actually be richer, better off, administer medical care better, and administer everything better if they were free market. Because if they're Scandinavian, they'll all do better. Then they won't have the disincentives, the bureaucracy, all of the other things that slow them down. They themselves would do better if they were more free market. And if they didn't have those welfare states, they themselves would service their own poor better if they were free market. I can't ultimately prove that. I can only prove that through theoretical constructs. However, I can say, again, specifically say that that of the 25 or 30 countries that tried that kind of welfare state capitalism, that their performance is pretty disappointing, pretty dismal. Some of them are in real trouble, and therefore it's not exactly an example we ought to replicate, especially since we are very, very unlike the Scandinavian countries, far larger, far more homogeneous, and more than likely, if we do get medical care for all, it's going to be like Veterans Administration for All. Pretty dismal outcome. So that's my main response to the argument that we ought to go Scandinavian.
For a reference on the VA scandal, you can Google 307,000 die waiting for medical service, according to CNN. That is the VA scandal that actually started here in Arizona. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with that one. A often criticism of capitalism is that you can hoard a large number of wealth. It's similar, but not exactly to my earlier question. Yeah. You can hoard a large number of wealth, so you can have billionaires in the world, and you can also have starving people. This shows that property rights are not able to meet human needs effectively. Therefore, socialism is morally justified. How do you respond to that?
Well, see, we got starving people, we got these billionaires, and they're hoarding money. Okay, so give me these toughies, Keith. Let's put our minds on it. They're hoarding money. They basically have $1 billion dollars in $100 bills stuffed in a mattress. They're not. Is that where it is? Because hoarding is that. What do you mean by hoarding? It's in a safe deposit box in a bank. They don't want to make any money from it. They don't have it in a bank. It's not being invested anywhere. Is that your hypothesis? You socialist, you? Oh, yeah. What?
Yeah, that this is devil's advocate.
Okay, I'm just asking. Yeah, I know it's devil's advocate, Steve.
So,
Steve, but it's in the mattress. It's hoarded. It's in the safe deposit box. It's off the market. It's not in a bank, because if it obviously were sitting in a bank in bank CDs, it would be invested, and it might be invested in farms that would be growing food that would feed people. So it would still be doing a lot of good. But you use the word hoarding, so I'm trying to take the word hoarding literally. Hoarding means it's in a mattress or it's in a safe deposit box. It's inert. It's not out there being invested. It's not anywhere.
And that, of course, is why they use the word hoarding, because it creates the picture of, all right, Hoarders is a show where people have, like, mustard cans from like 30 years ago. Okay. So hoarding is just irrational and unjustified. And I don't even have to think that it's
okay, just Keith, I asked you what you meant by hoarding. You meant by hoarding, again, you mean it's not parked in a bank. It's not with any financial institution. It's not stocks and bonds. It's not out there being used for productive investment. It's hoarded in a mattress or in a safe deposit box. Is that the case? You socialists, you're evading my question, Steve. Keith.
No, I'm trying to get into the mind of the socialists when they use the term wealth hoarding. So by that, I simply mean you own $1 billion.
Okay.
Whether it's under your mattress or in a bank account or in stocks, you own it. You have the property right in that $1 billion. So the existence of wealth hoarding, a argument against the legitimacy of capitalism and private property.
Okay, I won't go into the further questions how you got the $1 billion. I mean, obviously, if you stole the money, then I would say that you committed a theft, and the right ought to be wronged. So that's another question that arises: how you came into it. Did you acquire it in a just way? Because we libertarians understand that you could have committed robbery, forcibly taken it from somebody, and in that case, it has to be given back to the people you took it from. However, you are saying that it was justly acquired by capitalist standards. So the money is, if the money is sitting in a bank or sitting with some financial institution, it is being invested because you're getting returns from it. And the only way for there to be returns generated out of that money has to be invested by the financial institutions that are handing you your returns. So if that money is invested, then that money could be invested in factories and farms and being used to grow food, being used to turn out clothing and houses that can help feed other people. So the $1 billion is not really inert. But I guess the terrible thing is that, again, reverts to the idea that you're basically doing nothing with yourself. And so that's terrible. But how much of a dead weight loss is that anyway? Not much. It's just you. And since you said the money is being hoarded, you didn't even say you're consuming that much. You're just, eating your fill and you got a roof over your head. So how much harm are you really doing? Why is it such a major issue? Your $1 billion is out there being invested. But even if by the way, if your $1 billion is in the mattress, then it simply doesn't exist. All prices fall. It doesn't change the world. The $1 billion is just not there, and the money that is there, prices will fall accordingly. If we posit, for example, a stable money supply, you're just taking $1 billion out of the money supply, and the money supply then shrinks, and prices shrink, and everything else adjusts accordingly. You're simply not participating. Now, of course, if it's in a mattress, then we have to wonder, how are you even getting by? I guess maybe you're taking a little bit out of the mattress each day in order to buy your cans of food. I guess that's what's happening. But getting back to that starving person, the only way to feed the starving world is to invest in farms, for capitalist investment in farms. The record of any other way of producing food has been just horrendous. There was the famine in China. There was the famine that would have occurred in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, but for the fact that the U.S. bailed out the Russians with the Russian wheat deal and kept sending them food, by the way, into the 70s and 80s. because their farms were not adequate to feed the masses. And then, of course, there was the market liberalization in China that allowed farmers to sell their food. There was, in fact, some market liberalization in Moscow, in Russia, to allow farmers to till at least a couple of acres of land for their own profit. So, as a practical matter, if we want to feed the masses, we need investment. And getting back to that $1 billion, if the $1 billion is with banks, then those banks will invest it, food will be grown, and then to whatever extent it's possible to feed starving people, I believe the compassion is there. The compassion is there on the part of so many to make sure that people do not starve. And so the best chance for people not to starve is through private sector capitalism. And I guess at the end of the day, the only thing to acknowledge is it's really, I guess, unfortunate that this guy you mentioned, possibly his name is Keith Knight, he's got the $1 billion. He does nothing. He basically just spends all his time interviewing people like Gene Epstein, and he's not really helping anybody eat. And that's unfortunate, but it's a very tiny price to pay in return for the potential to feed the masses that capitalism produces. And then if we forcibly give his money to government, then what government basically does is it drives up the price of food by subsidizing farmers, by imposing set-asides, by imposing high prices on, and then on the other hand, it's got a food stamp program, so it raises the price of food, and then it issues a food stamp program, and that pretty much comes out as a wash to the extent that people are at all hungry. They eat because capitalism feeds them. So that problem you cited, Keith, is at best, a tiny price to pay for all of the benefits that capitalism brings.
Absolutely. And before the 70s food shortage, the Soviet Union did experience a famine in 1932 as well as in 1946.
And there was a famine in China in the early 50s. 36 million people dead. Yeah.
Yes. And as far as wealth hoarding, well, capitalism actually gives the great incentive for investments, for savings and interest rates to prevent such hoarding. So there's another.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I should have said, I could have played that card against you, Keith, but you said no. The guy likes to hoard. He doesn't like. But of course, look, you got it in the bank and so on. Again, I would say, even if you're keeping it in your mattress, Keith, you're doing nothing with it. It simply is not. It doesn't exist. The money supply shrinks. As long as you don't have government printing money, the money supply shrinks and prices come down. That's what the literal hoarder does nothing. There's no harm whatsoever. To the extent that people decide to have more, as Murray Rothbard put it, one man's hoarder is another man's person who wants more cash balances. If you want to keep more cash on hand, then all you're really doing, if people have more cash balances, then the effect that has would be to lower prices across the board, because then there's less cash in circulation bidding up prices. That's all the effect that hoarding actually, literal hoarding. Then, so at the end of the day, you and I have to say, Keith, you have the right to hoard. If hoarding specifically means keeping your money in a mattress or in a safe deposit box, it harms nobody. You've got the right to do it. It doesn't hurt anybody.
A often used justification for state intervention is that market failure exists. In other words, A and B engage in an interaction. This interaction negatively affects C, who did not contract to a deal, such as pollution, one might say. What is the capitalist position on the possible existence of market failure?
Yeah, well, okay, you use the example of pollution, which we should get to in a moment, because pollution is indeed, gets back to the example of throwing garbage on your neighbor's lawn, spoiling your neighbor's property in some way that does legitimate harm, that is a tort in terms of the law. But we can get back to that in a moment. But the general point about market failure is that we have to match it against government failure. The market failure argument is kind of leads to a non sequitur. Markets are failing us, ergo, therefore, government ought to step in. I confronted that just this morning by writing a tweet. There was yet another story in the New York Times about how an immense number of talented women are being underutilized in Hollywood. And so what I wrote is that there's so many deep pockets feminists from including guys like George Soros and Warren Buffett, who would be happy to finance something that would exploit this market failure. That all of these talented women who are being underutilized would then work in this new studio and produce great films because they have such talent. So market failure usually leads to market opportunity. The solution to market failure is market opportunity, because usually a market failure leads to an entrepreneurial opportunity to do better, to right that failure, to employ those women, for example, who are underutilized, who are so talented that they can produce movies that we all like. But oftentimes, as in this case, I said, that's probably a scary thought, because it's much easier to complain about what the studios do and say that because there's disparate impact, they don't employ enough women, that there aren't any talent, that all these talented women are being ignored. They must be doing it for that reason. So create your own company, and that company can employ those women, or almost any other market failure we might posit. But then even a market failure, trying to think of a market failure that we would say, well, it is a failure. There is a problem with it. But do we then say that government should step in? That government then is the solution? Well, government is less equipped than markets to cope with failure. There's market failure everywhere we look. Institutions fail us all the time. I think it's a market failure that Keith Knight is not getting paid $100,000 a year to perform this service of interviewing me on his show. In a just world, the government should probably step in and send and cut Keith Knight a check, $1,000 a week check or $2,000 a week check to do what he does. That market is failing me. Markets fail me all the time. Things happen that I don't like. But again, I can't always get my way, and I certainly don't see that government is a solution to it, because when government steps in, it only fails worse at whatever the market failure happened to be. But not enough artistic services. Well, there should be no more artistic services than we already have. There's no reason for there to be a national endowment for the arts. The arts are already getting subsidized. I have no right to forcibly seize other people's property. And then what the national endowment for the art? There's market failure because the market doesn't produce enough art. Well, if the market doesn't produce enough art, then it produces other things that more urgently satisfy people's needs. So oftentimes a market failure simply is one man's failure is another man's success, because the market delivers entertainment that people want, and it doesn't deliver entertainment that I might want. So if that's a market failure, do I have a right to go to government and tell government, well, you should remedy this market failure by subsidizing the kind of entertainment that I want? But getting to your issue about pollution is not a market failure. Pollution is actually a failure just of living in this world. We actually, of course, had worse pollution before the Industrial Revolution. We had horse manure in the streets that would have choked us if we didn't have the car that came along. So that would have been even worse than the car that came along. But of course, industrialism does produce pollution. It does produce, potentially, perhaps it's warming the planet. Potentially, it does indeed pollute rivers. Industrialism does that. It has polluting side effects. But of course, it's obviously not a market failure. It's an industrial failure. The very act of operating is going to pollute. And the solution to it, under any economy, be it socialist or capitalist, is, of course, that you can't throw garbage on your neighbor's lawn. And that there you have a tort. If it's the lake that you own, and if that lake is polluted, then by somebody else, then you have a right to sue that person, impose a restraining order on that person via the courts. Now, that is doable in a capitalist society. It's also doable in a minarchist society, because it is harm to person and property. Air pollution is not pollution of the air. It's pollution of our eyes and throat and nose through the air. So it's an invasion of person. That's air pollution. And so clearly we do have remedies through tort law to deal with it. And it would have to be dealt with whether we had markets or not. And of course, empirically, as you know, the social economies were even worse polluters the capitalist economies, which is a different story altogether. But pretty much again, the market failure of pollution is a tort, and tort law gets back to property law, gets back to the right not to have your person or property hurt, and otherwise market failure usually can be remedied through market enterprise, and where it cannot be, it's usually just my complaint that the market isn't giving me what I want. It's giving Keith Knight what he wants, but not what I want. And even if Keith Knight and I are unhappy, the idea that we want government to intervene and produce government failure, that's going from the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah, it's incredible that these standards only apply to the market when it's like, oh, okay, say there's a government and they pass a law, A and B pass a law that negatively affects C. That's the same thing. So government doesn't solve the problem. What if there's a war that A and B agree on and tens of millions of civilians get killed? What happens then? It's like everything they criticize about the market not only applies to the state, it applies to the state tenfold in every single criticism.
Yes, well, I mean, I'd even build on that and say, in a more garden variety way, the market failure of the monopoly that the post office had on delivering mail, delivering bills, that market failure was addressed to the extent that it could be addressed, because government still imposes a legal monopoly on first-class mail and legal monopoly on certain delivery of mail. It was addressed by the private sector, FedEx, that sent packages more speedily, and then of course addressed by email by all of the other enterprises about our sending ourselves messages privately. And now, because the post office is having trouble paying its bills because even with its monopoly, it's losing its place in the sun. But the post office was an example of government failure that the private sector has addressed significantly.
So a common objection by to capitalism by Marxists, it goes in this form in one way or another. The poor are inherently exploited because they are at the mercy of the capitalist or the employer, therefore are forced to sell their labor, therefore enslaving themselves. This creates a great deal of stress and structural violence. In other words, work, earn money, or you're going to starve to death, basically. So whether you die by a bullet from the state or you starve to death because of structural violence as the result of capitalist private property, there is no difference, says the Marxist. How do you respond to the exploitation of the poor and structural violence the Marxist claims?
The structural violence, of starving, Well, this is put well in terms of a nice rhyme by the economist George Reisman that actually, most progressives are Marxists in this way. They really do believe that the force of employer greed and worker need would mean that if the government didn't maintain minimum wage laws or support unions or have other rules and regs, that worker need and employer greed would drive wages down to subsistence. That means then that, of course, you either work or starve. And the interesting argument that can be made is that employer greed and worker need are plausible hypotheses, that there is employer greed and worker need. The employer greed, of course, is that employers would like to pay as little as possible for workers' services. So they're greedy in that sense, just like, of course, consumers want to pay as little as possible for goods and services. Employers want to pay as little as possible for worker services. That's plausible as a first approximation. There is employer greed and worker need. The worker need is that they do need to work, otherwise they starve. Most of them don't have a whole lot of savings. They can't go for that long without getting a job. Hypothetically, that's plausible as well. There is employer greed and worker need. But then Reisman uses another example of need and greed in order to point out why something else is going on as well. As he put it, let's say you're moving from Arizona to the center of Manhattan. You own a car, and that car in the center of Manhattan is going to be not only useless to you in the center of Manhattan, because you can always walk or take the subway, it's actually going to be a liability. It's going to be expensive to find parking facilities for it. So when you drive to Manhattan in that car and empty your personal belongings into the tiny apartment you're renting in Manhattan, you want to get rid of that car. So you have a need to get rid of that car to the point where you'd actually pay somebody to take it off your hands. And then buyers are greedy. They want to pay nothing for it if they could possibly take it off your hands for nothing. But then the question is, do you really sell it for nothing? Do you really pay somebody to take it off your hands? Of course not. You take it to a used car lot and they pay you something for it, or you look in the ads or on the internet and you sell it for the market price. Why is there a market price? Because there is competition, because there are buyers out there who want to buy cars, and you don't have to give it away, despite the greed and the need. And similarly, there are employers. If you go to any area where there are employers, there are hundreds of them, as a practical matter, who can buy your services and who want to buy your services. So you go to the highest bidder in terms of the deal that's being offered, and therefore you don't have to succumb to your need to get a job, and you don't have to worry about employer greed. And on top of that, the greedy employer, even the greedy employer who needs enough people, has got to bid you away from other greedy employers. So the wage rises as productivity rises, because as productivity rises and as profits rise, what the employer actually calculates is, how much profit can I make from this worker's service? If I can pay this worker $500 a week, and I can make a $50 profit, then it's worth it for me to pay him $450 and to bid him away from another company that pays him only $400. And so as profits rise and productivity rises, the workers' wages rise in accordance, despite employer greed and worker need. And as an empirical matter, we find that that's exactly what happened in the 19th century. We find that what happened in the 19th century, when there were no protections for workers and when unions were weak, is that wages rose. Real wages actually rose, mainly because of goods and services that were sold, because prices came down. But if there were really just employer greed and worker need, and employers had all the power, as the Marxists say, because you're needy, I just have to pay you just enough for subsistence, because just enough to get you to come to work, then what would have happened is that all the goods and services that were extra services that were produced would have gone only to the rich. But that did not happen. Worker wages maintained themselves because of competition among employers, just as there's competition for the car you want to sell when you move to New York, despite your need and the greed of those that want to buy those services. So that indeed is the key reason why wages naturally rise under progressing capitalism, despite employer greed and worker need. And also, of course, why, if the only employer is a socialist employer, a bureaucratic employer that has difficulty producing new goods and services, a bureaucratic employer who can dictate to you, then by and large, that you're going to do far better in a free labor market than you will under any conceivable alternative.
The another Marxist argument, and I say this to get at the fundamentals of what most progressives are saying today, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, that basically capitalism consists of surplus value, in which A hires B, and A only hires B because they know they can make money off of B. So they'll make more money, the surplus, than B actually earned. See, B is the one doing all the work. Why is A getting any of the benefit? Is surplus value an argument against capitalism, a justified argument against capitalism?
Well, I'm going to come at you with this, I guess, a somewhat surprising answer and say, this is where I sort of throw in my hands, and I would want to say to people like Bhaskar Sankara, or indeed those people who make this argument that it's an asymmetric thing, that the surplus value is earned by the capitalist, and the worker deserves the fruit of his labor, the Marxist exploitation theory. I then point out to them, look, this is a ridiculous argument, but I don't have to win this argument. Just buy the means of production. There's over $3 trillion in the hands of labor unions in this country in pension fund money. There's more than 40 trillion worldwide. 1/3 of all consumption is accounted for by the lower half of the population, and nearly 2/3 by the lower 4/5. That's an immense amount of financial power to own the means of production yourself. If you think it's a terrible deal for workers to yield profit to their capitalist employers, if you think it's terrible, in the example that I cited, the wage is $450 and the employer is getting a $500 value from the worker's service and making that extra $50, it's very easy for you socialists to own the company yourself. I suggested something else to Bhaskar and Kara, which I've suggested to other socialists. If you want to, the profit margin of most companies is about 15%. And so if you just control 20%, 25% of all consumption, and you boycott these companies, you can drive consumer companies into bankruptcy and buy them on the cheap. There's so many different ways for you, given the financial wherewithal of everybody who you think feels exploited, to buy the means of production and to own it, and no longer to be exploited by those capitalists. And so do it if you are so convinced that workers are exploited, because then probably what will happen is you'll have a sub-economy, a socialist sub-economy, and then there will be capitalists who will be exploiting workers, and then workers can make their choice. Because if you're offering such a better deal, hey, look, we're going to employ you, and we're giving you the full value of your labor. Those capitalists down the street, they're taking surplus value from you. So, my God, workers will then flock to you. Won't they? They will flock to you. Now, I doubt that will happen. I think the workers will actually flock to working for the capitalists. Partly because, by the way, if we're also talking about people wanting to make decisions over the running of an enterprise, I think you'll find that most people really don't. I didn't. I worked for Barron's for 26 years. I focused on what concerned me, which is writing a column about the economy. I didn't focus on all of the entrepreneurial decisions that had to be made to run Barron's, or the entrepreneurial decisions that had to be made to run Dow Jones, or eventually News Corp, because News Corp owned me. I didn't want to be concerned with those things. I wanted to be concerned with what I did, and I accepted the potential that my salary was that there was skimming, that the capitalist employers were taking something from me, and that was the part of the value that I was producing for them. Now, Keith, you and I know, of course, that it's ridiculous to talk about exploitation, that clearly the capitalists are doing something very important with that money. And that there is a right of they do justly earn it. I think it's interesting to get into the realities of that, but again, I think the simplest way to finesse it is to call their bluff. 1/3 of all consumption accounted for in the lower half. Over 3 trillion accounted for by labor unions. You can own the means of production. You can buy it if you feel exploited. Of course, a lot of people do feel emotionally exploited, and that's why there are millions of people who start their own businesses. There's Keith Knight, who's probably just an unemployable guy who wants to have his own business and doesn't want to work for anybody else, mainly because you don't want to take orders from anybody else. You want to do your own thing. And of course, that's wonderful too. And that capitalism, by the way, offers that potential. It also offers a collective, organized group of people to buy up the means of production, to channel their consumer dollar to the companies that they run, and to say finis to this. This is an end of exploitation. We own our own company, and nobody's being exploited. If that floats your boat, that's what you should do. Now, there's further answers to your question, but I believe that the simplest thing to do is to finesse it in the way that I just have done, because that's the argument I put on the table for Bhaskar and Kara.
And it's just one of these intelligence tests,
Yeah.
usually to say surplus value, because they don't recognize that the person goes to the capitalist, to the employer, because the capitalist came up with the idea, got the investors, bought the land, invested in the building, keeps the lights on, found the customers, is constantly innovating to keep up with competitors. And when they just go up surplus value, I cannot believe that this discussion needs to be had. But
Well, yes. Well, yeah. No, I want to elaborate. I want to make a key point and elaborate on your point. Two things that I would want to add to it is that this is an interesting thing that I first learned years ago when I read Man, Economy, and State by Martin Rothbard. As he pointed out, in principle, there is no return to capital. There's only a return to capitalists, meaning that that there's a return to those who own land and resources, and there is a return to a worker. In other words, but capital comes from combining the efforts of workers with the efforts of the resources, and so in the creation of capital goods like offices or stores is essentially reversed, essentially just derived from the returns to those two, labor and land. The key point is that the capital itself is not getting returns in the initial phase. All that's really happening, as you said, is that the capitalist is putting up the money at risk. While the capital is being produced, workers are getting paid, the landowners are getting paid, and that money is being put at risk. That risk capital, and also consumption is being deferred on the part of the capitalist. That's time preference. So those are the real returns that come to the capitalists. Because again, Rothbard liked to insist, in a way, in a perverse way, unexpected by those socialists and Marxists, there is no return to capital. The only return is to capitalists, the efforts that they make. And indeed, we could go back to a Robinson Crusoe economy about that as well. If Crusoe and Friday are basically picking berries and fishing right off the shore, let's say they want to produce a boat that they can go out further into the ocean and fish and catch more fish. They have to spend a good part of their day producing that boat, and that boat yields them nothing while they're doing it. And so that boat has to give them an extra return. And so that's exactly what the capitalist puts up the money and the time and the resources to produce that boat so that more comes from it. But again, it all reverts to their own labor and to the wood they use to produce the boat. The reason why they want a larger return is because of the time and the risk that they're incurring by building that boat. And so that's the key point. But you're right. However, you're right, but in a way, isn't it just better to throw up your hands, just as I did with these people who these feminists who said that women are being underutilized? Well, start your own company. You take on the headaches. You take on the risks, and then you won't have to grouse and complain that the capitalist is exploiting you. I mean, because again, it's important to say, by the way, because indeed, there are all kinds of idiosyncratic people that want to do their own thing in this world, and I think it's wonderful that they do. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. I wouldn't mind seeing a few successful communes. It's a very difficult experiment. It's failed for many years. The attempt to reduce communal workplaces, they have very limited success. However, I'd love to see it succeed. I'd love to see it flourish. Why not? Whatever makes you happy. At the end of the day, it's not consumer sovereignty. It's not capitalist sovereignty. It's individual sovereignty in a capitalist economy.
Absolutely. Yeah. I totally support voluntary communes. One of the problems, though, yes, there's economic and division of labor problems, but when a group of people tried to form a commune in Waco, the ATF came in, the government came in and murdered them all because they defended themselves a couple months prior. So again, if you want a commune, don't want a state. All right. Another objection, so there's the exploitation objection of Marxism, and then underneath lies the alienation objection.
Oh, yeah.
Workers are hereby stripped of their humanity and are placed under this sort of tyrannical Puritan work ethic of work, work, work. You're not an end in yourself. You're simply a means to an end. The end is production. The end is capitalism. And this leads to just psychopathic materialism. What is the capitalist response to the Marxist claim of alienation?
Well, actually, I think it's even more important to play the "you can start your own company" kind of card. Again, when I talked about all the consumer power that is in the hands of the masses, that if Bhaskar and others, Bhaskar Sankara, my antagonist, when I debated him, if you're convinced that there's such alienation out there, such dissatisfaction, then you can say we're going to produce a lot of enterprises that make people happy. Now, how are we going to make you happy? Well, you're going to be able to have, it'll be democratically run. You'll have a vote in how things work. You'll whatever else. Oh, there'll be equality of income. You won't have to be angry that certain people are earning more than you. Whatever supposedly produces alienation, because the other reality that you have to face is that pretty much you want to produce things that other people want to buy. And what else will we do? We'll have you work in companies that produce goods and services that you really personally believe in, that you love to produce. And so that would be good too. So again, if you really are convinced that no matter what a capitalist does, everybody's alienated, then the groundswell of anger and emotion should be such that it would be easy enough to organize the consumer dollar to only buy from those socialist companies, to get backing by saving through crowdfunding, and create the alternative, the unalienated sub-economy under capitalism. That's all quite possible if you're so convinced that working for others, for Jeff Bezos, for example, and others who are so intent on making profits. But the other answer to the question really is that a market economy offers, as a practical matter, offers the least chance of being alienated. If it's truly a market economy, offers the least chance because it offers the maximum number of employment opportunities. I mean, I would want to do away, by the way, with restrictive licensure of all kinds, including for doctors and lawyers and all professionals. I would want to have, I believe in certification. I believe there should be private sector certification of doctors and lawyers whom I would be willing to engage. But I don't think you should have to go to school to become a lawyer. I don't think you should have to necessarily have to go to school to become a doctor. If there was a reliable branding by the private sector of different doctors and lawyers, I would want to go to those people. But ultimately, we might say, however, that so therefore let me finish the point about if you then have a range of employment opportunities, if you have the potential to get backing to go into business, the ambition to create your own business, if you don't want to work for others, if you have a range of possible employers, a range of possible jobs, you should never, ever think, what is the thing that will maximize my monetary income? You want to make a living, of course, but really, most people do not only maximize their monetary income. Sure, they want to do well, but most of us are sane enough to understand that we want to maximize our psychic income. When I decided I didn't want to go to law school, I wanted to become a journalist. I was maximizing my psychic income and happy I made the decision. And so your chances of being alienated are far less. Now, but at the end of the day, the real problem is something else. The real problem is with the division of labor society. And this is a key issue in Adam Smith, who was really so confused about so much, ironically, even though he was good on so much as well. He was very ambivalent about the division of labor society. He's very eloquent about the division of labor society in the first chapter of his book, The Wealth of Nations, where he said that's a very key thing that brings riches, that we specialize in certain things, we become good at certain things, and we trade with others. That's the division of labor. But then much later in that book, he called the division of labor society profoundly alienating. Maybe some people find it so. The dream in the 1970s was to be self-sufficient, create your own autarkic commune. But the truth of the matter is that none of those people were really doing it. They're all thoroughly hypocritical. They were living off the communes that were created in the country in the 1960s and 70s. Were importing oil. They were living off the largesse of the division of labor society. Because the argument of those people who believe in it, in the alienation theory, really is strictly that when you're producing a good that goes out to strangers, that is profoundly alienating. And if you want to be self-sufficient, certainly there are means to do that. But if you want to do that and live in a self-sufficient commune, you're going to have to pretty much go back to the standard of living of like circa 1700. And that's your choice too. That's the other thing. Do it. Don't be alienated. Grow your own food. Own a windmill that produces your own energy. Do what you want. Live the unalienated life and produce your own stuff and the things that you yourself value, and don't buy from others. Don't trade with others, because that's profoundly alienating. If you alienate in that way, which is, by the way, really the core of the argument that was made about alienation in the 1970s. I don't know if you're familiar with the Whole Earth catalog, with all these dreams of being self-sufficient. If that's the core of the argument, capitalism also offers you the alternative. Indeed, the Amish, what do they live? They won't own cars. I mean, they believe that certain material goods of affluence in American society are sinful, and turn them off. And so, if you don't want to own a car, if you want to drive a horse and buggy, all that's quite doable. If that means that your alienation factor is reduced, all of those things are quite doable. If you're really alienated, on top of that, you can become a hermit. Go knock yourself out.
The intellectual dark web member Eric Weinstein has been saying that basically capitalism, while beneficial, has its death note written into its algorithm. In other words, this constant innovation will lead to a production system in which only machines can really do the work, and people being more expensive to employ will no longer be able, or it will no longer be profitable to employ them. Therefore, a universal basic income, state control of these things is then morally justified. How do you respond to free trade and innovation destroy jobs? That's an aspect of capitalism. Therefore, capitalism is unjustified.
Well, you and I know, Keith, because I go back to the 1950s when that prediction was being made by a guy named Norbert Wiener. It's been, it goes back to the Luddites 100 years ago, that clearly jobs are just specific jobs are always destroyed, and that's what brings material benefit. I'll revert to an anecdote from Milton Friedman, which is kind of a good classic one, where he was visiting Egypt, and ditches were being dug by workers with hand shovels, and he asked why weren't they using steam shovels, and the bureaucrat told him, well, this is not just a public works project, it's a jobs project. And Friedman said, well, if it's a jobs project, why are they using shovels? They should be using spoons. And so obviously the shovel was the big threat in the old days to the Eric Weinsteins of this world, because it abolished a lot of ditch digging jobs, because people were using their hands probably to dig ditches before then. And so that was terrible. And then jobs were going to go disappear because of that. So it never seems to happen. But I'll get to the possibility that it will happen. It never seems to happen because economics really is about scarcity. We live in a world of scarcity. What is scarcity? Scarcity simply means that what everybody wants always adds up to more than there is. And if what everybody wants always adds up to more than there is, then there will invariably be ways for entrepreneurs to employ people in productive occupations, because there will always be scarcity. There will always be a hunger for more. What everybody will want will always add up to more than there is. And if that's the case, then there will always be jobs. But if I want to imagine, and then of course what else happens, because is that the work week shortens. The work week used to be 100 hours. 100 years ago it was 60 hours. Without government intervention, it went down to 49 hours in the 1920s, and then it's gone down further. It goes down because there is a kind of a trade-off that people make between work and material goods, work and leisure. And maybe there will be a 3-day weekend. The 2-day weekend came in as a standard because there was a trade-off. We could work more and earn more, but and be richer, but we would rather have the leisure. And of course, leisure in itself produces more demand for leisure goods. And so if we had a 3-day weekend, there would be enormously more demand for amusement parks and other forms of entertainment, cruise ships and other things that we consume in our leisure. So that in itself would create more jobs. But if Eric Weinstein, if you're quoting him adequately, and he's talking about innovation will be such that machines will do absolutely everything. And if he means by absolutely everything, there will be an end of scarcity. And if there's an end of scarcity, then it really means that what everybody wants does not exceed what there is. What everybody wants is just equal to what there is, and the machines are all doing the work. The next part of that is the argument that means that workers are going to get screwed and only the capitalists will make any money. Well, there's so many loopholes with that argument. If we really are bursting with largesse, I mean, bear in mind that over time things get given away. Things are so cheap they're given away. Toothpicks, matches, pens. You go to a place. Can I keep this pen? So all kinds of items that are so abundant are just given away. And so basically, the toothpick, which is given away, is going to become all goods because the machines are just endlessly producing everything there is. Then we'll have an interesting world, but it will really mean that everything will be so dirt cheap that it will be given away. So it's very difficult to be fearful about what would happen under those circumstances. I doubt very much that it ever will happen. I do believe that there will always be certain cravings beyond what machines can never offer us, and that there will always be plenty of work, and as long as entrepreneurs are allowed to do their thing. And of course, in that world of machines doing all the work and of goods raining down on us and everything becoming as cheap as toothpicks, then you'd only have to work maybe 2 or 3 hours a year, maybe doing something or other, running messages for somebody or whatever else in order to live for the rest of the year. You're not going to earn as much as those people who work a lot harder, but why wouldn't you be happy if that's your choice? There'll be more than enough goods to go around. But reverting to the more realistic point, scarcity is very, very unlikely to go away. And certainly the machines doing all the work is a century away, 2 centuries away, and a century or 2 centuries from now, we'll have other kinds of needs, other kinds of things that we want, and more than enough labor for everybody. Entrepreneurs will find ways to employ that labor because, again, what everybody will want will still exceed more than there is. So there will always be pent-up demand for labor, the scarcest resource of all.
Yes, if you look at the agricultural times of America, I think it was 80% of people were employed in agriculture, and now it's 2%. So the Eric Weinsteins of the world must have been like, okay, so logically there's 78% unemployment in America. Oh, and there's free trade and there's immigration. Oh, there must be 1% employment in America, but of course, nothing the fear-mongering statists say ever comes true, unless, of course, they're the cause of it. Then you better believe it's coming true.
Well, then yes, of course, but then they fall back. Oh, this time is different. There's that this time is different argument, and if this time is different, well, then we're predicting the future. And again, I was trying to go into the future and saying that if scarcity is ever abolished, it will be a very odd world. But they conjure up the idea that everybody will need a forced universal income. I wanted to get to that part of it. It's obvious that the obvious response to the argument about the universal basic income is let's wait and see if you're right before we actually do something that's potentially destructive of workers' incentives. Let's see if it really does happen. If it does happen, then we can talk. If it does happen, as I say, it does happen, then that scarcity is abolished, and that machines are producing torrents of goods because scarcity is abolished, and there's no more any need to even have labor to build more machines or to repair the machines that do break down. If we don't need any labor at all, then again, all goods and services are going to have the value of toothpicks, and all of it will just be, displayed in the streets for you to take up as you want. If we can imagine that fantasy world, then we can counter it with that fantasy. All goods and services, cars will have the price of a toothpick, and toothpicks are free, so cars will be free too in that crazy world that they talk about.
All right, I have 7 more questions for
you. Oh my God!
If you want to lightning round these, or do you just want to do 1 or 2? Which would you rather do?
Well, probably lightning rounds are probably not good, Keith. We have to get into the depth of things. So let's just do 2 of your favorites, because we don't want to talk in sound bites, Keith. We want to talk in paragraphs. So let's just do 2 of your favorites. Yeah, okay. So go ahead.
Okay. So capitalism leads to monopoly, say the critics. You basically have one person or group of people who is really efficient. So what they do is they keep their prices low, get a lot of people to come there. That's how they become so powerful. With that money, they buy up their competitors, giving them a total economic stronghold, an unelected stronghold over the economy. This puts consumers at the mercy of these tyrants who have now gained a monopoly in the industry. Is this a justified argument against capitalism?
I like the way you raise your finger. I'm not elected. So you're getting into the swing of it, Keith. You're turning into that monster socialist. You're getting convinced of these arguments, Keith. I've got to, get you back on the straight and narrow about capitalism. But yeah, with respect to monopoly, I guess the first thing to say about that is that the argument about the monopolist who buys up everything, lowers the price, and buys up all the competitors, and then will hike the price. That's it's almost impossible to find an example of that. When John D. Rockefeller, that's the guy who left you all that money, Keith, that you were hoarding. When all he ever did was lower prices, he never raised prices, and of course, and indeed, he believed in the Standard. That's why it was called Standard Oil. He had and it was called Standard Oil because he wanted the oil to have a standard, and that of course was not oil for your cars. It was actually oil for it was heating oil. It was oil for lamps. That it would have a standard kind of oil that he think everybody would want to buy because they knew that what they were getting, and he kept lowering his prices. But he obviously recognized that if you start raising your prices, then you make yourself vulnerable to entry and competition, certainly in a global marketplace, it's almost impossible to imagine having any kind of monopoly that ever means anything, because if you are the only game in town, and if you hike your price, then you are a signal. You are vulnerable because you're out there. You've got your neck stuck out. You're an example of how there is a market for this thing, and this market is great, and I'm doing well by it, and I'm charging a lot by selling the product. If you hike your price, and if you do hike your price, then what will happen is there will be entry into the marketplace. So it's not normal for monopolists to do that. It would be perverse on their part to do that, to abuse their monopoly if they ever do achieve a monopoly. And of course, monopoly is almost impossible to achieve. But why is it impossible to achieve? Because almost the very definition of what a market is very difficult. If you monopolize all the trains in town, then you've also got to monopolize the buses. If you monopolize all the trains and the buses, then you want to monopolize all the cars. It becomes more because if you're charging too much for your particular niche in a particular service, then people will revert to related services. And so it's really following a will-o-the-wisp. Although with that said, in a way, the competitive process is the pursuit of monopoly. By that I mean this. Keith Knight would like there to be only one Keith Knight. He'd like to establish his brand and his specialty, but make himself only one Keith Knight. Walmart wanted to make themselves only one Walmart. What was Walmart's specialty? Walmart's specialty was selling brand products at very, very low prices. That was their specialty. And producing, and because why did they have to sell brand name products? Because the prices were so low, customers would not trust the product unless there was a brand name. But then when Walmart did that and drove so many other companies under, that then others stepped in. Others started to imitate them. That's the difficulty because you're out there. Your example is cited, is noticed and is cited. So the very act of pursuing monopoly is in a way the competitive process, because Keith Knight wants to make himself special. Gene Epstein wants to make him special. Walmart wants to make itself special. And in that way is servicing the consumer, is serving the market more effectively in the very pursuit of monopoly. But most realistically, the Walmarts and the Keith Knights and the Gene Epsteins of this world know that there will never be a way to be the only irreplaceable person. It helps your market to be the only irreplaceable person, but you'll never make it, because we know that there's too much out there. The assumption you made in your question is, well, you're the only one who can do it. You're never the only one who can do it. Certainly not in a global marketplace. And of course, we know that the only real monopolies that have ever been maintained, even for a while, of course, there's the OPEC cartel, and even that's government-controlled oil. And even that, of course, has had difficulties. A cartel is only as strong as its weakest link. The weakest link being that when you're maintaining a very high price for the oil, then one of those links is going to start underselling in order. And how do you maintain that high price? You're maintaining that high price by limiting the supply. But if each partner in the cartel limits the supply, then they're limiting their revenue. So the temptation is to break the cartel by underselling and selling more of your particular good as part of the cartel, and that's often what destroys the cartel. As a practical, empirical matter, we find that these things rarely work out. They rarely succeed for very long, and to the extent that they make any difference at all, maybe they make a little bit of extra money, maybe they exploit us a little bit, but they do so. But legitimate pursuit of monopoly does enormous good, because legitimate pursuit of monopoly is through price competition, through quality competition, to produce something that's so good that people will want to buy it. Similarly, of course, now we have the monopoly of Amazon. This guy Bezos comes along, and out of nowhere, he drives Barnes and Noble under. He's even driving Walmart to the wall through selling food. And so he has his own monopoly. I'd like to go to his site and buy from him. But if he doesn't keep his prices low, if he doesn't service me properly, then I can take my business elsewhere. He will only last for as long as he services my need, to the extent that he does monopolize what goes on. And at the end of the day, the only monopoly we really should worry about are monopolies like the one maintained by the post office over first-class mail. The ones maintained as a matter of law by government are really the only monopolies that we should be concerned about.
Isn't that the great contradiction? The people that are so terrified of a company getting really big and then everyone being dependent on it are like, there should be a Federal Reserve monopoly on currency and the interest rates. The government should have a monopoly on AR-15s. The government should have a monopoly on compulsory education. The government should have an FDA monopoly. These people they're walking contradictions, and they think, I went to Cornell. You're stupid if you believe in any of this stuff.
I'll tell you some. You're good. Yes, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I can see how you get worked up talking to people like Bhaskar.
I get worked up. Yeah, exactly. I'm getting worked up talking with you, Keith, because you're pretending to be a socialist. But I have to make sure I will be debating another socialist this coming year, and I'm going to keep calm. It's never a good idea to get worked up. You have to be patient and be nice to them. And certainly I should have been more patient and nicer. Hopefully I have done so with you. I'll tell you another funny anecdote. Just amazingly, perhaps you don't know, that was it 10 years ago, that Office Depot and Staples wanted to merge. So they sell office products. They sell, notebooks and pens and stuff like that. And so antitrust would not allow it. And because antitrust claimed that they found that where there was only one Staples or one Office Depot in a particular neighborhood, the prices were slightly higher than if there was both Office Depot and Staples in the same neighborhood. Like a little bit of a difference in price. And they're going to maintain a monopoly. They're going to hike the price. They're going to exploit us. God knows, my God, those pens and those pieces and those pads of paper are going to cost a fortune. And then you thought, my God, did you ever walk into a drugstore? Did you ever walk into can you really monopolize the sale of pens and paper and stationery and loose leaf binders? I mean, obviously, if they're going to hike their price by too much, then they'll suffer competition. And so the merger was canceled. I mean, it was just, again, the most laughable possible thing to talk about, that an Office Depot and Staples was going to be a monopoly that couldn't be stopped, and they couldn't allow the merger.
And of course, I forgot to mention their favorite monopoly, their monopoly on the right to issue taxes and force people to buy things against their will. The monopoly argument was greatly responded to by Milton Friedman when he says, instead of government intervention, I think there should just be universal free trade, promote the most competition possible. Yeah. And if you look at things like the minimum wage laws or regulations, these make it harder for competitors to enter the market and compete and give us more products and services to choose from, give employees more chances, more opportunities to compete with these people. But again, government is the problem when that they claim that voluntarism is the real problem. Yeah. My final question is, what did you learn? What is the most important thing you learned from Murray Rothbard?
Oh, wow. One most important, I learned so much from Murray Rothbard, Keith. Okay, now we're going to go for another 3 hours because I'm going to have to give you the 30 things I learned from Murray Rothbard, because they're all equally important, Keith. The most important thing.
I'm not on a time constraint. If you want to go,
okay.
Like.
Okay, no. See, I'm on a bit of a time constraint. So
okay.
So you called my bluff, Keith. That's good. And I told you that. No, when I read Men, Economy, and State, which I just picked up just coincidentally, which is the first great book I read about economics, which turned me into an Austrian. The most important thing that he taught me at the time was all of the misconceptions of mainstream economics, and so in a way, maybe the best answer would be the sort of thing that I confronted so many years ago when Murray Rothbard changed my life. There is a collection called Economic Controversies, collection of Rothbard's essays, and the first sentence in the introduction to those essays reads, "It was more than 40 years ago when Murray Rothbard changed my life. I had the honor of writing that introduction." And I talked about how I picked up his book, Men, Economy, and State. And here is just the minor thing that blew my mind. There was such a thing called monopolistic competition. Imperfect competition is what it was also called. And it was the standard thing in the mainstream textbooks. And it talked about the example of something that's called Joe's Barbershop. And Joe, and this is really, truly, maybe you wouldn't believe this, maybe you haven't studied mainstream economics, but this is what is still taught, that Joe's Barbershop is a monopolistic competitor. Joe's Barbershop is monopolistic because it's Joe's Barbershop, because Joe has monopoly on his name. There's only one Joe's Barbershop, so that's why it's monopolistic. It's competitive because it's a barbershop, and of course there are other barbershops. But then the next part of it, which I guess you wouldn't believe, but this is what the mainstream still argues, is that monopolistic competitors are always operating with excess capacity. And it has to do crazily with the way you draw a demand curve and a supply curve, and a cost curve, rather. And so Murray Rothbard, first of all, pointed out that in the case of Joe's Barbershop, why would Joe be so stupid as to have excess capacity? Why would he invest in excess capacity? Why does it make any sense in terms of human action? I was teaching monopolistic competition. Paul Samuelson, in his textbook, Paul Samuelson was the Nobel Prize winner who wrote the most popular textbook. And he wrote in his textbook that when you walk into such a barbershop, the chairs are empty much of the time. And what I realized was that Paul Samuelson probably took his haircuts during the week because he was a professor, he had the time. He didn't realize that Joe was actually had empty chairs during the week because he had to plan for peak demand on the weekends, on Saturday and Sunday when people were off and they came in for their haircuts. So, Keith, this is probably more answer than you bargained for, but it was just kind of funny. It just showed to me the craziness and the stupidity of a Nobel Prize-winning economist like Paul Samuelson, who can write in his textbook that Joe's barbershop has excess capacity, and notice the chairs are empty much of the time. Because that's probably what he was observing when he walked in there. It didn't occur to him that on the weekends, probably there was a certain queue to get a barber, to get a haircut, and that Joe had to keep a balance between peak demand and the lows in demand. So during the week, the chairs were empty much of the time. So then Rothbard pointed out again that Samuelson is accusing Joe of being so damn stupid that he's perennially investing in excess capacity. And then Rothbard pointed out that there is a different way of two different ways of drawing that cost curve so that Joe is no longer operating with excess capacity. He would be operating pretty much according to the low point of his average cost curve. And so that, in a way, was what taught me that the mainstream is in bed with mathematics and graphics, and they cannot think in terms of human action, of the way people operate in markets. They want to think in terms of math. They want to pretend that economics is a branch of physics, and this gets them into possible confusions about how Joe's barbershop would operate. And then on top of that, Rothbard, in effect, taught me that the mainstream also is in love with power. The mainstream economists are also in love with power. They want to sit at the tables of power. John Maynard Keynes, Milton Friedman, what a terrible thing I just said. Alan Greenspan is what I meant to say. John Maynard Keynes, Alan Greenspan, all the others who want to sit at the tables of power. And so that, too, is the problem with mainstream economics, not just the economics of the socialists, but the economics of the mainstream. And so that's what Rothbard taught me.
And Samuelson also said in his book, Economics 101, I think that's the title. He said that by 1990, definitely by like the year 2000, the Soviet Union will surpass America. So we better start centralizing control here, unless we want to get behind. That is what Ayn Rand called the argument from intimidation. Anything that shows disapproval or not being cool or not being rich. All right, my final question is...
Well, just more, I have to say something about that, too. No, Samuelson, he kept putting up a graph. He had a line that showed it was at the time it was called gross national product. It's now called gross domestic product. It was the Soviet Union's GNP, and the line was supposedly rising faster than the U.S. GNP. And so then he took that line of the Soviet Union GNP and he extrapolated it as rising faster. And he said, by this year, the Soviet Union is going to be earning more money, is going to be richer, is going to be outproducing the U.S. And so it was based upon extrapolating lines. But the fundamental point about that was that not just that the problems of the foolishness of extrapolating a trend, of assuming that a trend that continues at a certain rate is going to continue to rise at that rate. That was just a foolish leap of faith. His fundamental mistake was to realize that if you're having what is fundamentally a capitalist society, the U.S., mainly a capitalist, and what is mainly a socialist society, the Soviet Union, you're not measuring the same things. What he was measuring on one graph was government's national product, rather than private sector GDP. He was measuring the wrong things. He was so out to lunch that he did not understand that when you don't have markets, you're not producing what the masses want. You have no market test for it. You just have a lot of crap, a lot of crazy industry that the government in the Soviet Union is producing that has nothing to do with real output. So you're comparing two different things on the same graph. That was his fundamental mistake, his fundamental obtuseness about comparing the output of the Soviet Union versus the output of a fundamentally capitalist economy. That was his problem.
And that's another real world example. America versus the Soviet Union, or Chile versus Venezuela today.
Well, you see,
Examples of
okay.
capitalism.
Yeah, okay, just a moment, Keith. See here, you run into this bit about, the Soviet Union started behind different cultures, different, that's where I'm much more comfortable, Keith, and I've counseled you to say, look, if you want to say it's apples and oranges to compare the Soviet Union with the U.S. or one country with another, the different cultures, different sides. I believe, by the way, it is a little bit apples and oranges to compare the U.S. with Sweden. I would compare Swedish Americans with Swedes, because then you're controlling for the culture. It's much easier to say, look, East Germany versus West Germany. You had a controlled experiment. North Korea versus South Korea. You had a controlled experiment. You're pretty much controlling the cultures, the same people, and look at the difference in performance between the two. That's what I would say. Much easier to make it the argument that way, rather than get into the can of worms about making comparisons about different histories and different cultures and all the rest. Because culture does matter. Culture does matter. The Swedish Americans are richer than Swedes in Sweden, and Danish Americans are richer than Danes in Denmark. That's the key point. As Milton Friedman said, we have no poverty among Swedish Americans either.
Those are great points. I greatly appreciate the tip. And just my 10 seconds final question.
Sure.
If you could recommend one book for everyone to read, what would that one book be?
One book? God almighty, you make it difficult. The one book. Let's see. Well, I would try. God, now I'm going to mention two books. Okay. Well, okay. Actually, I'm going to surprise you by saying that I'm going to mention a great economist who's a non-Austrian who does have problems, but he tells great stories, and he's very readable. And the book is called. It's got a kind of a lethal title, Basic Economics, and it's written by Thomas Sowell, the African-American economist, who he said he wanted to write a book about economics that had no graphs in it, but just basically illustrated economic principles through stories and through history. And he does it brilliantly, and it's a very lively book and a great read, Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, and he addresses most of the issues that you and I have raised. I think because he's not an Austrian, he makes a couple of mistakes, but overwhelmingly, that's a valuable, highly readable book that I recommend to others. There are many ways in. I would say my way in was Man, Economy, and State, because I was teaching economics at the time, and so I was really ready for a great treatise like Man, Economy, and State. But if it was just to the general audience, then I would say to the general audience, the best bet is Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell.
Gene, thank you so much for taking the time today. I greatly appreciate it.
I'm sorry I didn't have 3 more hours, Keith. I only gave you a little 2 hours. I enjoyed it. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you. And you can visit the Soho Forum site that is in the description below. I cannot wait for July 25th, I think it is. Yeah. The Soho Forum is having a debate between Stephen Hicks, who I've had the pleasure of interviewing, and Thaddeus Russell on postmodernism. I might have to fly out to New York for that one.
You get a comp ticket if you do, and it's actually July 15th, Monday, July 15th.
July 15th.
Monday, July 15th, yeah. Okay.
Terrific. Gene, thank you again. And thank you to everyone who stayed this long. I really hope you got some value out of this time.